implicitly, followed by the majority of a culture. Now, whether the 1,000 years is true or not, I think he makes a great rhetorical
That's what
point.
the House of Justice said in that letter.
These are like,
it's going to be many generations.
yeah, it's generations and generations away, which isn't to say we're powerless and okay, we can't do anything about it. But I think in terms of what we can do about it, it's hard to imagine a better path of approach than, first of all, to educate oneself about the actual facts. There's so much about our history that has been whitewashed.
Right.
And, I also, growing up in a small town, southeastern Washington, as...
His mom went to school there.
Really?
Seventh-day Adventist, yeah.
Oh,
Walla
cool,
Walla
yeah.
University.
Yep. My grandparents were Adventists.
Oh, really?
Is that right?
My
Where did you grow up at? Where did you grow up?
I was born in Walla Walla, but I kind of grew up childhood years in Connell, which no one's heard of.
Yeah, I know. Isn't Walla Walla a prison town? Do they call it, or is that just?
Walla Walla has a state penitentiary.
Yeah.
It's now known more for its onions and its wine.
Ah, that's right. I
They
always
say
hear about the
Hope so.
Walla Walla
Prisons.
onions. Yeah.
But,
That's the marketing program.
but but more Connell. Connell was very kind of white, and I remember my education about our own history was very, very white centered, and to the extent that it went into details about the exploitation of Africans and native peoples. It was more of a footnote or a side note, and I feel that's one thing that we can do to help reverse and change the culture. It has to start with education. How do we educate our children, and can we, and it's such a battle to get anything into curricula now, because there are people on the other side trying to keep out, saying, well, we shouldn't, wallow in self-hatred, we shouldn't,
Right.
Which is also true, but there's a need to, I think, to have open eyes about what our real history is in all its ugliness, and as well as in all of the great, principles that we're still trying to live up to.
Not just the glory, but the story.
Yeah, that's a good way to put
We
it.
can't acknowledge those truths, and we can't get to a deeper discussion on the nuances of them. Like,
So that would be like, so part one is like, fully educating ourselves, and there are, for example, alternative histories that have been written from the perspective of colored people or indigenous people, and it's really interesting and disturbing somewhat, because I hope this isn't as it should be, to pick up and try to read it, as someone who's gone through the traditional system and seen it from the traditional lens, to see a completely different take on all of these major events, other events not appearing at all, other events coming in that I'd never heard of,
What do you mean the White House is all built by black slaves? You know what I mean?
Things like that.
Right.
And the second
Marcus
part,
Whitman.
I remember going to Whitman Mission as in like 4th or 5th grade field trip.
Oh yeah.
And going to Whitman Mission is an indelible impression of seeing the foundations of the mission, and seeing all the details of where this missionary was assassinated with a tomahawk, and this missionary's throat was cut, and this, all of the
Well, you probably didn't get the
details
other
of
side.
that.
of
And
the
yeah, you
story.
didn't get the other side. You got the side of the savage Indians, destroyed this peaceful, God-fearing, missionary family, and that was kind of the implicit story. And
I'm from Walla Walla too, and my brother retired there, and he said they have taken down that site.
really, the site no longer exists.
I couldn't believe it. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
At the very
interesting.
least, they needed to change the narrative. I
Oh,
think.
for sure. Yeah.
But the second thing is having like real friendships that cross these lines, these invisible lines that divide us.
Your talk is cheap, show me. Right? Show
You're
me.
tough. You're tough.
I know I am. I know I get a little hardcore on that, but the truth of the matter is,
But you're right.
until and unless then you can have all the idealism, and you live in your bubble ideal world, right? But then when you're observed from the outside, then all of a sudden, what do you mean? It's all you're
All segregated.
it's exactly right.
Yeah.
There is a young lady, Isla, in North Carolina, and there was a white preacher, and he died. He was 93 or 4 when she met him the last 3 years. Christian preacher, and he was in this country. He raised money as a reasonably young man. He raised money to build the first integrated, fully, right from day one, integrated Christian church. Okay, and what he went through is unbelievable. He was a very courageous white man, and what he went through is unbelievable. It's now run by a black minister because he passed away about a year ago. And
What's his name?
and I'm sorry, I'm having a brain freeze on it. It'll come to me in a minute. Anyway, she befriended this white man. She is a Baha'i, young Baha'i, and she really was so impressed with his capacity, how he built this church, and the death threats, and all through civil rights and all of that. He was last year. He was 90 something, so he goes back quite a bit. And so she asked him if she could make a documentary out of his life, because as a Baha'i, and what it takes, you talk about white supremacy, what does it take to put your money where your mouth is?
Mm-hmm.
So don't tell me, show me, right? So, and she felt that he was an example on show me. So he agreed, and so she interviewed him on and on and on. And then she interviewed some of the senators from that district and the representatives from that district. And then he not only built his church through death threats and family and children and, that he had of his own, and how the people had to trust him to go into the church together during a time where this was really dangerous, to be honest, right? And so and then some of the Baha'i, she'd never made a documentary in her life. She just sort of went out there and rented something, and she thought, oh, I can do this. And then some of the Baha'is in the community there decided, oh, they better help her, and somebody needs to hold the camera while she's up front. And so this came through. You've got a copy of it. I sent it to you. So she begins to interview them all, and I was just looking at it from my own perspective, how I try to be an example in that, but I still have this incredibly flawed, being born in Germany, at my era, oh my God, we don't, just say we're German, everybody, oh, you know what I'm saying?
Mm.
So I have to be very careful when I talk about that, and, but you have to show me. And so in the end, then he goes out and then he builds not only the church, then he builds a senior center where they all come together. Then he builds something else where they all come together. So this guy was just like this explosion of whites and black, learning to support each other. I mean, this whole thing was just amazing. And how she ever met, and she even invited him to come, when we had the centenary for the 2017 and 2019, he even came to the centenary before he died, and I thought, oh, that's wonderful that she was able to do that. And eventually he really aged out and he died, and now they have streets named after him, blocks named after, I mean, he was just a white man who decided very early in his life, I'm going to break the mold. And he did, and led by example. And then the people around him believed in the idea, and they led by example to show the rest of the community. And today it's such a flourishing.
Now, what city is this?
I know it's in North Carolina, and I think it was, I'm not sure if it was in Durham or Raleigh or Chapel Hill. I'm sorry, I forgot where.
Okay, but
where,
somewhere in the
but
south,
in there,
yeah.
right? And so, and I shared this video with some of my friends, because usually documentary they're an hour and a half, unless it's Stephen, right? It's very hard to listen to an hour and a half or 2 hours, documentaries, right? You have your favorite people. but several of my friends said, my God, I listened to the whole thing. I just couldn't tear myself away because this man was incredible. And she interviewed him for a long, long time before he died. So she had enough material from him. And it really brought home the point to me. In fact, I want her to come here to talk about the making of this video. What did it mean to her? And she's sort of in mourning right now because he died, and then how could he die on her? This was her explosion into the documentary world, right? And she really did it, and she finished it. And the city where she sit, they're having at the university or with one of the big places there, they're showing her documentary to talk about white privilege and how we can cross over that rainbow bridge. Somehow we got to figure it out. And they felt that her documentary is really an example in true life because it was the very first in America where they were able to break that from day one when they raised the first diamond penny, it was going to be all about black and white sitting together. Do we get this, right? And where's the money going to come in, and do we get this? And so it was.
And yet we have the race amity conferences in 1921.
So and I can give lots of examples. When just 100 years ago this year, Louis Gregory was in Seattle, and he talked about the coming together of the black and white races. And at the Y, they gave him a big banquet in the end in the Baptist church where my friend is her church, right? So we can go back 100 years in Seattle alone, but the truth of the matter is, look how white we look in this group, right? So the truth of the matter is, we're still, though in all fairness to the museum, we at times we are quite diverse, but so we're not always white like we are today. So therefore, yes, I agree that white privilege is, and now he addresses white privilege from the pulpit over and over again. And please, I want you to listen. I send it to you for a reason.
Have you heard of the Pupil of the Eye Center in Birmingham, Alabama, by Angela Murray? It runs by Angela Murray. She's like you. She runs a center like this.
So therefore, we need to have more examples, more discussions, and more dialogue on that topic, right? And it's not enough to go, and the minister is very good. He said it's useless, he says, to go white shaming or black shaming. He said it doesn't do anything. It doesn't get us anywhere, and everybody, the guilty people, just go home and they don't want to be around you. So he is very centered in engaging in his audience, He says, we have not come here to white shame or black shame, either one of you. And then he of course, he's a Baptist minister. I think he's Baptist. And then he just talks about what Christ taught. Christ taught is a message of love one another. And he has this wonderful way to do away with the guilt tripping and the shaming. And I think as Baha'is we really, and I think you said that very beautiful. It's about the unity, of it all. And if we are not the example, if we don't by example lead that, then we're just mouthing off. I'm sorry, then you're just kumbaya in your own bubble.
Do you think curriculum will be changed, Doctor?
Well,
to include more
CRT right now, right?
Yeah.
And everybody is talking about it. It takes time. I think the reason why, this is why I call it God's plan. I think why we got climate, we've got the pandemic, we got somebody looking at the nuclear button, right?
Yeah.
I think the reason we have this triage of oopsies going on right now is because everybody's fleeing everywhere from somewhere to someplace, right? And all of a sudden, we're living in neighborhoods where we all look a little bit like from everybody. And then we have a little crisis and say, oh, honey, I'm so hungry, please. Oh, sweetie, I know that your kid's shoes are getting a little too short. My kid just outgrew it. Why don't you come over? I think bartering and social care and spiritual caring is going to come back in style. And I think it will be science. It will be science that will show us why, as a species, we're naturally that way. It's just that our consciousness is still too subconscious that we need to bring it more into the forefront, and it cannot go through the division of the what we call the messengers or the revelations all that we have. If you come to my revelation, everybody will be happy, right? No, it's really there's just one God, and it's his or hers or its creation, and therefore that's the only way we can come together. And I like to think that this place here will make it as its major focus of discussion, where if we don't by example lead the topic of race, gender equality, climate change, whatever it is, especially science, because I think that is the key to unfolding. And I know you said we are nowhere near in consciousness to understand consciousness, but we're sort of sensing it, we're sort of feeling it, we just don't really understand it yet.
Yeah. Since
Am I
it really
wrong?
ought to be at the center of the stage consciousness.
Yes,
Whereas at the moment it's like way off to the side.
that's right.
It's an epiphenomenon. It's a
Yeah.
froth, on the sea foam. It's
Right.
just, that's not essential to the movement of the waves. But that's where I think the narrative has to take us. We have to find this new sacred narrative
Yes,
that everyone on the planet can sign into
yes,
without signing away their own
culture.
cultural inheritance.
That's right.
So it has to be, in a way, a meta-theology.
Unity and
it has to be a
diversity,
theology
right?
above theology.
Yeah.
One that sort of accommodates and validates all that has gone before, sees it within the context of the evolution of consciousness.
Yes, that's
And,
what it is.
As far as it's as an official statement as you can find, not in the Baha'i writings, but more recently by a statement prepared by the Universal House of Justice, the governing body of the Baha'i faith around the world, and they said that Baha'u'llah did not come to bring one more religion
Yeah.
to stand alongside the existing sort of choices of sectarian organizations. Rather, has he recast the very conception of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. And that, I think, in a nutshell, sounds the keynote
Yeah,
of the new sacred narrative that humanity
yeah,
has to find. Because that's a narrative that embraces science,
right.
it embraces spirituality / consciousness. Spirit and consciousness become kind of identified with each other. It embraces the whole collective evolution of the human race, whether physically on this planet or culturally or spiritually, as part of a process which is not, in the end, a random process. And that's kind of where the scientific story of today, as much as people like Neil Tyson and others, try to...
Intelligent design and all of
Well,
yeah.
that's a whole...
Yeah.
That's contra that. But
Yeah,
the
that's
people
what I
like
mean,
Tyson
contra that.
and Carl Sagan, as much as I've been inspired by Carl Sagan, like, massively throughout
Yeah.
my life, but really the best they can do is say the universe fundamentally has no meaning. There's fundamentally no direction to history or to life or anything. But here we are, we're special, and momentarily we fill that void of meaning by creating our own meanings. And so let's celebrate that for the few years that we have, until our sun runs out of nuclear fuel and goes nova and it's all
Whoopee.
over. And that's the sort of story of science. And you see lots of people trying to take that thread and run with it. Sean Carroll, just name your popular science writer of today, and they'll have they know their science, and they're not misrepresenting the science. It's just that they only see half of the circle, and the half of the circle they see is, in the end, entropy is going to win, and it's all going to run down, and sooner or later life is going to be extinguished, and that's it. And meaning is not intrinsic. And that's where the narrative that the human race needs to adopt for this next phase of its evolution is one that sees history as having a direction,
Yes.
that sees life and cosmic evolution as having a direction. Not a direction that impels or coerces,
Yes.
but a direction that invites and persuades at the level of human intellect, where we see that the direction is love. The direction is unity. The direction is consciousness. Because why? Ultimately, they justify themselves because they're great in and of themselves. But they also can be justified in a pragmatic sense, as the more we love each other, the more human civilization can be cooperative rather than competitive, the more it can unlock the resources of the planet, the more it can lead to the full expression of both the individuality and the potentiality of all of the members of the human race. All of these are just pragmatic outcomes of saying, let's just try love for a change. That's what Abdu'l-Baha said. He said, we've tried war for thousands of years, let's just try love for a change. And that's what Baha'u'llah says also about, clarifying all of the mess of religious history and religious doctrines, which people endlessly argue over and say, well, there's one God, no, there's three gods, no, God is a weird idea anyway, let's just do without God. Baha'u'llah says that all the laws and ordinances, all of the stuff of religion has changed from age to age, except for one thing, which he says is the law of love, which like a fountain is constantly being renewed and is constantly flowing. That's it. In the end, sort of the final analysis is it's about love. Why is it about love? It's because in the coming together of things, we create and complete the circle of existence, which is the one becoming many and then returning to the one. It's like such a simple picture of existence. And it's that returning to the one is the coming together of things, and that's through the force
like
of
it
love.
started, right? The density of the Big Bang, so to speak. It comes back to that.
Yeah. So it's all simple in the end. The simple thing is just go out and love people, and don't worry about the superficial differences, which we take to be so important, but really they're so superficial.
Yeah. You had a question, I know.
Yeah, it's about veganism. So, this is not a big relevant topic in many parts of the world, but here it is. And I happen to be a vegan and a Baha'i, and I have had dialogues with vegans who aren't Baha'i or maybe atheists, and there's this hope among many vegans, and this is not really why I became a vegan, but many people, and the most ardent vegans become vegan, it seems, a lot of them at least, because of their concern for animal welfare, animal rights. And there's sort of a hope among kind of vegan thought in like the West or whatever to like extend our love, extend care and concern from just simply humans to other animals, and that the refusal to do so throughout history has constituted a genocide, actually, of conscious beings capable of pain and suffering. And I found that it seems like the furthest I've ever been able to get with vegans is if you reject the notion of a human soul, whatever that is, some special condition that human beings have. And it can't be rationality, the thinking goes, because not all human beings possess rationality. There's people with birth defects, deformities, injuries, that they seem to have been reduced from the voluntary action to their involuntary action. They don't seem to have this capacity for self-reflection. So what's this magic condition that can apply to human beings and make it so that we're the species most worthy of concern, and not of the 50 billion cows that we eat or whatever? And if it's a soul, then I guess you're in good shape. But if you don't, if what even is a soul? And I'm curious what everyone makes of that.
This is where the idea of the circle of existence, I think, can be really helpful, because the circle of existence takes the notion of spirit and it puts it on a gradation. It doesn't say spirit is a binary, 1 or 0. You either have it or you don't. It says spirit is an emergent phenomenon which is present in all things, from the atomic level all the way up. And Abdu'l-Baha says this over and over. He talks about the mineral spirit, the vegetable spirit, the animal spirit, the human spirit, and beyond. The spirit of faith, the Holy Spirit. It goes on and he talks about levels of consciousness beyond that, into which we as human beings are born. But by adding and extending the notion of spirit to include inanimate objects as well as, you know, other beings that have consciousness to a degree, including ones that we eat nowadays, it naturally leads to at least a future state of civilization in which, as Abdu'l-Baha says, it's considered somewhat contrary to compassion.
Somewhat.
He puts it very gently, you know, but because he's trying to gently invite people. He's not forcing. Again, this is like not the coercion, but the persuasion. It's like, no, you're forbidden to do this. No, if you really understood how everything is interconnected and how we are part of our environment in ways that we don't acknowledge now with our Western lens of subject-object, if we recognize that our environment is part of us and we're part of our environment, and lifting up our environment is part of our own spiritual path forward. If we understand that, then we naturally will start extending the circle of our regard to animals capable of feeling and, you know, and beyond, to the, you know, to try to maximize, you know, the evolution of consciousness and minimize the amount of suffering. So for Baha'is, eating meat is not forbidden. Abdu'l-Baha says it, you know, it's sometimes necessary for nutritional reasons to eat meat to, you know, to become stronger. Maybe that's a controversial
For
thing,
vegans.
Maybe nowadays, I mean, 100 years after Abdu'l-Baha said that, we have options that they didn't have 100 years ago. So even maybe that's that can be modified according to our current knowledge of nutrition and ability to manufacture, synthesize proteins and all that sort of a thing. But he does suggest that vegetarianism is the wave of the future, and I think it ties in naturally to this recognition that the boundaries of selfhood, you know, seen through a true spiritual lens, extend beyond the limits of our skin, and it actually extends all the way outward into the universe. There's a fascinating writing by the Bab, the forerunner of Baha'u'llah, who gives us a kind of sketch, you know, shortcut, you know, key to happiness. He says there are 3 keys to happiness. He basically says, and if you follow these 3 things, then sorrow will depart from you.
Okay, I'm listening.
So
we are all listening. You got us
so
now.
he says, first of all, and 2 of them you've heard before, so they won't come as a surprise. He says, one of them is the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The second is always tell the truth.
Okay.
And the third, and this is the interesting one, is he phrases it in a very compact way. He says, never be satisfied with anything when once you become aware that it has a still higher degree.
Ooh.
I like that.
Write that down.
So that's like a really profound one,
Yeah.
because that gets to this question of
Don't
our
stop.
awareness of ourselves goes beyond our skin to our environment. And suddenly it makes sense why also people who maybe read some of the Bab's writings, he says some really strange, outwardly strange things about, like, when you build a house, you have to build it as perfectly as you can. You know, if the doorway is too low, then that's actually a kind of spiritual crime that you've committed. The very walls of the house, if they're improperly constructed, will cry out to God for deliverance because you constructed it wrong. You know, the Bab himself was known to wear very nice clothing. You know, he wasn't wearing sackcloth and ashes. You know, he was a merchant and he wore clothes befitting his economic status. And how do you square that with this idea that spirituality is somehow must be correlated with dirtiness or poverty or lack? The Bab says actually you should, to the extent that you have power and control, lift everything up in your environment to its highest degree of perfection. So it's a very simple thing, and it comes down to, like, pick up after yourself, right? Clean your room, you know, be tidy. Very simple things are matters, but obviously not taking these in dogmatic finalities or not forcing other people or haranguing other people, but lifting everything up, finding a way to catalyze the sort of reaching the perfection of its own degree. And when it comes to our environment, that has such profound consequences, because now it's not that we see ourselves as the end-all be-all of existence, and whatever advances human thought or human civilization can be done at the expense of pillaging our environment, because after all, human beings are the only ones with souls, so we're the only ones that matter. But if we think of spirit and soul as something which is actually present everywhere in its own degree, we take away that binary, then suddenly we're operating in a world which is much more organic, and in which we see all the interrelationships as much more vital to our own day-to-day existence.
Not wanting to take, and I'm going to ask Stephen that, but not wanting to do anything good. I'm a junk food eater, so we're the opposite, right? You're not.
Oh, it's vegan junk food.
Oh, you're okay.
Oreos.
Well, junk food's not really food anyway, so don't
So,
worry.
but having said that, so now I'm coming in a little bit on the scientific area. So I'm saying, oh, trees talk to each other and plants have feelings too.
Yeah.
And what you're doing, you're eating things that have feelings and that talks to each other.
They have no brain.
So therefore, Mr. Science, can you address the vegan perspective versus?
Well, the vegan
There's no nervous
perspective
system.
is there's no the sentience of a plant. Well, the hard line, a lot of them will just say plants aren't sentient, and they just have this delineation between sentient creatures and non-sentient creatures that requires a brain and a nervous system.
Another truth.
And this is how they. And then so degrees of sentience depend purely on the cognition ability of a creature, the way they define it as, and that can even be lacking in human beings if they're developmentally challenged. For instance, there's this thinker, Peter Singer, that recommends that we remove speciesism from our society, our preference, needless preference for human beings. That's a travesty. Instead, we have to make everything to be based on cognition ability, because that equals consciousness, that equals ability to suffer. That should be our metric.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. We have
someone's dog is higher than their disabled relative.
we have to make pragmatic calls.
I prefer petability as the metric.
Petability.
There you
That's
go.
good. Yeah. That's a good.
Well, people
hard
act
line.
like that whether they believe it or not.
What do you mean?
My dog is more important than my...
Yeah.
Right.
How
My
many
husband will
spouses
tell
say,
you
you
my
love that
dog's
dog more than you love me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But in terms of like the pragmatism of the Baha'i teachings, this is where the pragmatism also comes in. And we can't, as long as we're living, and as long as we're to, fulfill our spiritual function in the world, we can't escape that circle of existence that we're bound to. There's one of the talks that Abdu'l-Baha gave that's was more recently released, which is entitled "The Eater and the Eaten."
Oh.
And he basically goes on and says, this is the reality of our physical existence on the planet, that everything is either eater or eaten. And we're not going to escape that. So what we can do is evaluate, how much suffering is being caused and try to minimize that. But it's not a matter of, we just can't, it's part of the fabric of our existence. And we have to
Well,
operate.
fish eat other fish, and then they have to stay alive. Fish.
That's right.
So that's an
Yeah.
example of eating something living, and it's part of the cycle of
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
Although I don't think I would love to be a vegan. I don't know how to do the diet. I probably diet malnutrition, but I don't like the idea of killing mammals. And I don't
Yeah.
like that.
Sure. Yeah. I don't. Yeah.
You see, I started becoming a vegan, and then all of a sudden I was diagnosed with iron deficiency, anemia. So I said,
You have to
can't
be
a
very
vegan
careful.
anymore.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I had several friends, the co-workers, and that's what happened. We all of a sudden, some of the social workers all became vegans, and boy, what that really backfired, and they had to re-examine the health.
I
Okay.
was healthier.
Lack of
Yeah, I
protein.
mean-
Anything
Yeah,
else.
lack of this and lack of that. They didn't
So-
realize. They just saw fruits and nuts, and I'm good, and and veggies,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
But you look healthy, so there's got to be some kind of a
He's also
recipe
young,
that's
they can get away
healthy.
with anything.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like meat causes cancer, so there's a whole
lots of things cause
dimension to
cancer.
this.
Tobacco plants.
And no
Plants
fish either.
cause
Do
cancer.
vegans have fish? Do they eat fish?
No.
No fish either.
That because it's an
fish.
animal. But
With a face.
And they don't
Yeah.
go to
And
zoos
he's
either.
half Danish, and his great-grandfather was a milk farmer, dairy farmer in Denmark. It's almost.
Hey, I mean,
Good for you for changing the generational dialogue.
Yeah.
I guess I didn't want to bring this up to pressure people to become vegan. I'm most
I don't
disturbed.
feel pressure.
No
I'm more
pressure, but
disturbed by
definitely.
notions of speciesism. I find ridiculous.
The integration of philosophy and science, which is the kind of like a veganism,
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating because
It's great.
we talk about things, we want to talk about consciousness, you know, and
Yeah.
and yet we know that plants feel pain, and we know that trees recognize their
Yeah.
family members and treat them differently than they treat other trees.
Sure.
So that's part of our innate nature, I think, as any species, to have that sort of bias towards our own kind. It's built in for survival. So, but we are a different species than we were when, I don't know, I think you call him Bob.
The Bob, yeah.
The Bob.
Yeah.
Okay, but when you're talking about like it's okay because it's part of sustenance and et cetera, we can now survive.
Yeah.
And it really doesn't take much nutritionally to change your understanding of how to prep food and become vegan. And yet, I am no longer vegan. And that, and then there's all the political and philosophical and aspects to that. And so I don't think
People
we're
would
pressured.
crucify
I
you.
love that you brought that up because it does. It brings up, that's a real life anchor to some of the more spiritual, philosophical side to the concepts that we're talking about. How do we apply this now? Because that's how we're going to get
Yeah.
to that unity.
Yeah.
We have to apply this somehow.
Yeah, that's right.
Above and beyond
Yeah.
saying love.
Yeah, I was mentioning earlier in the meditation room, when we were talking, that all the revelations, whether it's all the way down to Hinduism, which is the oldest religion, all the way through Judaism, right? Every single one of them came to a flat earth society. They didn't know that the earth was round. They didn't know, so really revelation was brought, what is relevant to society during the time that that it needs to be for future civilization, right? So I'm paraphrasing him, and I'm doing a very poor job, but it is a fact. Baha'u'llah is the first one that then came to a scientific era. So therefore now, even though you might hear us mention the Baha'i faith a little bit more than necessary today, but the truth of the matter is, this is today a scientific era, and we can't go back to scriptures that came to flat earth society. So we might be mentioning a little bit more of that, because he writes volumes, 200 volumes in fact, that touches on science in a huge way, and future society, maybe even an earthling of their society, right? So we're just adding a little perspective that we don't need to be self-centered and thinking that we are better, because they're all the same, because they only bring down what is necessary for society at that time. And now we are in the year 2022, by 2100 and 2200. Then some of the things you said, well, the Bob said this, it doesn't make sense right now, right? Then all of a sudden we're looking back and say, you know what, that makes a whole lot of sense right now, right? So we'll have to realize that 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years from now, it needs to make sense then. And the language, all of them have is the measures of love. Love is the empathy builder, love is the cohesion, love is the glue. This is where it's at, it will never change. And it's just a long range pattern, so we're just going to have to sort of take it from there, don't we? Love makes the world go round.
And hopefully we'll have enough water. I mean, with what's been going on,
Yeah. So, well, Stephen, I know he's got a wife waiting and wondering when is he coming home, and he's all the way inland. So I'm going to relieve some of your diplomatic sweetness that you have been giving us more than 30 minutes.
Thank you.